In Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. Then in books 2 through 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we just read some of book 2. We didn't read anything from 3, 4, or 5. But in books 2 through 5, he gives an account of one kind of virtue, namely the moral virtues. And what that does is it helps flesh out this outline that he gives us in book 1. Happiness is virtuous rational activity. In books 2 through 5, he tells us what some of the virtues are and what the rational activities that they govern are. And so we get a clearer picture of what exactly happiness is, what exactly this target is that we should be aiming at as we live our lives. In book 6, he turns to talking about the other kind of virtue. So in book 1, chapter 13, he says there are two kinds, general kinds of virtue. There's moral virtue or character virtue on the one hand, and then there's intellectual virtue on the other hand. Book 6 deals with intellectual virtue, and it's what we're going to look at now. So he begins his discussion of intellectual virtue by dividing the soul again. So he brings up the parts of the soul again. So we're going to do that, right? And so we saw this in book 1, chapter 13. There's your soul. That's what it looks like, apparently. Aristotle divides it in book 1, chapter 13 into an irrational part and a rational part. And he subdivides the irrational part into what he calls the vegetative or nutritive part. That's where the kind of life activity that we engage in, where our cells regenerate, our body digests food, and our pump blood and the nutrients to our tissues and so on. That stuff is totally irrational in the sense that we can't exert any kind of rational control over it. That's the vegetative nutritive part of the soul. We talked about that already. And then also the appetitive part of the soul. This is where our desires, our emotions, our feelings, our passions, as our translation calls them, where they come from, right? And that appetitive part of the soul, as we've seen, as he talks about in book 1, chapter 13, it can be persuaded by or be made to listen to the rational part of the soul. And so as far as Aristotle is concerned, that appetitive part of the irrational soul kind of counts as rational. It's going to have a role to play in happiness, right? Because happiness is concerned with rational activities. And so you might think the appetitive activities, well, look, they're in the irrational part, so they're not going to have anything to do with happiness. Aristotle wants to say, no, they are rational in a sense. They're quasi-rational. They're rational in as much as they can be made to listen to reason. And so that's enough to kind of count them as rational as far as Aristotle is concerned. And so the feelings, the emotions, passions, desires, and so on, all count as rational activities according to Aristotle. Another way to think about this, they are all activities that involve or require reason. They all involve or require concepts, right? When you're afraid of something, you're afraid of that thing. I'm afraid of whatever, the lion or whatever it might be, right? That's conceptually loaded. That involves reason, right? And so it's a rational activity. It's conceptually loaded in as much as I'm afraid of the lion, of that thing, that kind of thing. Okay. And as I was just discussing, we talked about the virtues of that appetitive part of soul. So those kinds of activities count as rational. Another way to think about that, Aristotle has told us now what a bunch of the rational activities are that are going to in part constitute happiness. Feeling fear, feeling confidence, feeling anger, experiencing these pleasures of touch, and so on. All of these are rational activities. And so we would want to know what the virtues of them are. In general, Aristotle says that the virtues of the appetitive part of the soul are moral virtues. That's what he talks about in books 2 through 5. And we saw how his discussion went. We saw his list of virtues. So these include virtues such as courage, temperance, generosity, and so on, right? So what we know then from books 2 through 5 is that happiness is, in part, feeling fear courageously, right? That's the idea, right? Okay. That's all by way of review. That's stuff we've seen. That's material we've seen. Now in book 6, he returns to this diagram, and we're going to talk now about the rational part of the soul and the virtues that go along with it. And the first thing he does here in book 6, chapter 1, is he divides the rational part of the soul into two, subdivides it. And the two parts are what he calls the calculative part and the scientific part. And in various places throughout his writings, he'll switch up his terminology. And so sometimes he calls the scientific part the theoretical part, and sometimes he calls the calculative part the deliberative part. Now, I mention that in particular with regard to the calculative part because I think actually that deliberative is a better word. It's less misleading. It's more accurate. It's clearer. And we'll get to why in just a second. Okay, so we have these two parts of the rational soul. What exactly does he mean by them? Why are they different? What's going on? Well, Aristotle wants to say the difference between these two parts of the soul is what they're concerned with. The scientific or theoretical part of the soul is concerned with invariable things, okay? And the calculative or deliberative part of the soul is concerned with variable things. And that's pretty much all Aristotle says. And he just thinks, oh, yeah, okay, you know what that means. Good to go. Perfect. Great. Moving on, right? But that's not clear at all. What on earth is he talking about? Start with the scientific part of the soul. It's concerned with invariable things. What does that mean? Things that don't change, that don't vary, that are always the same. Do we ever think about things like that? Or what does that mean? 2 + 2 = 4. There's an easy example. 2 + 2 = 4 is invariable. It's always the same. 2 + 2 = 4 right now. It equaled 4 yesterday, 1,000,000 years ago, 5 billion years ago, and it's going to equal 4 in 5 billion years in the future. 5 billion years in the future, it'll equal 4, right? It always equals 4. It will always equal 4. It always has equaled 4. It's invariable, unchanging. More generally, the truths of mathematics are like that. Even though we discover them, what we're discovering is something that's been true all along, right? So the Pythagorean theorem, for example, was discovered by the Pythagoreans. People think it wasn't actually discovered by Pythagoras, just by people who follow Pythagoras. It was discovered by the Pythagoreans. So people didn't always know it, but once they, a squared plus b squared = c squared, when you have a triangle or whatever, right angle triangle. But they didn't make it. They didn't invent it. That was always true of triangles. It was just they discovered it at some point. That's how these invariable truths work, right? We discover them. We discover that this has been the truth all along. Okay, concerned with invariable things. More generally, science is kind of like this. Now, you might think, well, that seems a little bit odd because, in science, we're like studying things that change all the time, that move, right? You study cylinders rolling down inclined planes, and you study whatever, frogs that jump around and so on, right? Aren't those variable things? Aren't those things changing? The frog is born, it lives, it dies. The cylinder starts at the top of the inclined plane and rolls on down. Now it's at the bottom and acquires velocity on its way down and so on. Isn't that all change? Well, Aristotle would want to say what the sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, what they're concerned with really are kind of general laws. And so the scientist who studies frogs, say, is concerned, maybe with particular frogs. Sure, fine. They go out and study them and whatever, cut them open and look at what's going on inside and so on. But what they're really figuring out, what the science is really of, are the kind of general universal truths about frogs. It's about frog nature. And then particular frogs kind of instantiate that nature and exhibit that nature. But what scientists are really concerned with and what they really come to know is this kind of invariable nature of frog or whatever. And that's an invariable thing. Likewise with physicists. What they really have knowledge of is not how fast, right? I don't know if you can see this is a pen, right? Not the exact details of how fast and how long it takes that pen to drop or whatever. That's actually kind of beyond what scientists can do to say exactly with exact precision what's going on. No, they don't really know that kind of thing. Moreover, that's not really what they're concerned with. Who cares about that? That doesn't matter. What they're concerned with are, for example, the laws of gravity. Force equals G m1 m2 over r squared, something like that. Or now it's been modified because of Einstein's relativity or whatever, and I don't know what the modification is. Whatever. Those things are invariable, right? The law of gravity has always held. It will always hold. That might not strictly speaking be true for the beginning of the universe. If anybody's into physics and the Big Bang and so on, I don't know the details of that, but just put that to the side for now, right? Those laws of nature, those laws of physics, of science, are always true. And we look at the thing rolling down the inclined plane, we look at a pen dropping to figure out these general, universal, invariable truths, right? And so in Aristotle's view, that's really what science is concerned with, figuring out and knowing those invariable general laws, say. At least when it comes to physics or something like chemistry, typically don't talk about laws like that in biology. I don't know, maybe biologists do, but but when it comes to something like biology, what they're concerned with maybe is not figuring out these general invariable laws, but figuring out these kind of general universal natures. And in Aristotle's view, he didn't have any notion of evolution, so put that to the side. He thought the nature of frog has always been around. It didn't evolve. It always existed. Aristotle thought there have been frogs forever, infinitely back in time. There have been frogs, and not just frogs, but, trees and humans and everything else. Okay. So that's the idea, right? So frog nature has always existed, and frog scientists come to understand that nature. That's the sense in which that upper right part of the soul, the scientific theoretical part of the soul, is concerned with invariable things that don't change. And again, I think the easiest example of that is probably math. Okay. Turn now to the calculative or deliberative part. Calculative, I don't like that translation because it makes me think of math, of like using a calculator and 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 5 equals whatever it equals. You can slow down the video and figure it out for yourself if you like. You can pause the video. But that's not at all what Aristotle has in mind. He's not talking about calculation. That's why I don't like the translation. He's talking about deliberation, trying to figure out what to do. What should I do? How should I act? This person just said that, and I've got to do this, and what should I do now? And you have to think about it. That's a different kind of activity, a different kind of rational activity, according to Aristotle. It's different than figuring out math or figuring out a physics problem or something. And deliberation, right? Calculating what to do. That's the idea. That's where that word comes from. Again, I don't like it. I prefer deliberation. And so the deliberative part of the soul, it's concerned with what Aristotle calls variable things. Well, what does that mean? Well, what he has in mind are human goods, human actions, what human beings ought to do. Right? Deliberation is concerned with what human beings ought to do, how they ought to act. And Aristotle's idea here is that there are no general laws or principles that we can apply, that everything that we can think of is variable. So you might think like, well, or at least most of the things when we're deliberating about how to act, right, are going to be variable in a sense. So in one situation, the appropriate thing to do might be to, write a check for $50 or something, right? That might be the generous thing to do in some situation. But it's not a general rule that's always appropriate, that's always generous. In other situations, it's not. And so it's Is giving $50 the generous thing to do? Well, it varies. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And it doesn't vary just upon your own beliefs or whims or whatever. That's not the kind of variation. It's just that's the nature of these things, right? It's the nature of the practical circumstances that we find ourselves in that sometimes, the appropriate action in one context is not the appropriate action in another context. It just depends upon the particularities of the situation. And the situations that we get ourselves involved in that are just part of human life are so particular that we can't come up with general rules. There are no general rules. And so these things are kind of variable, Aristotle wants to say, right? Whether or not you should give $50 is variable. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Whether or not you should, I don't know, drink that glass of wine. Well, you shouldn't drink wine. I don't know how many, 21, whatever, right? Whether or not you should drink that glass of wine, that's variable. In some situations, yes, it's fine. In some situations, no, it'd be inappropriate, and so on, right? That's the idea. That's the sense in which the deliberative part of the soul is concerned with variable things. Now, last thing I want to say about this distinction, is that this is widely seen as an innovation of Aristotle's. Aristotle was the first person to see that there are these two different kinds of thinking that human beings engage in, and that they're different, right? That scientific thinking, is one kind of thing, and deliberation is a different kind of thing, and they are just different, such that one person might be very good at one and not the other, and then vice versa. Another person might be very good at the other and not at the one, right? So somebody could be very good at deliberation, at figuring out how to act and what to do and what's appropriate, but they might be terrible at math, right? Likewise, somebody might be a math genius, but be terrible at figuring out what to do. They're the last person you'd go to ask for advice about some situation you found yourself in. And so these are two different kinds of thinking, and you can be good at one and not the other. That's Aristotle's idea, right? Okay. And so he draws this distinction. You don't really find this distinction prior to Aristotle, this distinction between theoretical thinking and practical thinking, right? That's another way to think about it. It's a distinction between theory and practice, right? So we have theoretical scientific thought on the one hand, you have deliberation or practical thought on the other hand. Okay. So that's the distinction he draws. And the intellectual virtues, as we already know, are going to be virtues of the rational part of the soul. And so now what we need to do is figure out what the virtues of the scientific part of the soul are and what the virtues of the deliberative part of the soul are. And lucky for us, so you might be thinking, well, moral virtues, there were a million of those things, right? And there's just a big long list. There's not a million intellectual virtues. There are two of them. There's one for each part of the soul. The virtue of the scientific or theoretical part of the soul, he calls wisdom. The virtue of the deliberative part of the soul, the calculative part of the soul, he calls practical wisdom. These are two different things. Sometimes our translation calls wisdom the virtue of the scientific part of the soul. Sometimes our translation calls that philosophic wisdom, I think in an effort to distinguish it from practical wisdom. But that's the virtue of the scientific part of the soul. And then the virtue of the deliberative part of the soul is practical wisdom. Sometimes practical wisdom, not by our translator, but by other translators. Sometimes practical wisdom is translated as prudence, right? So that's the idea. And what we're going to do in subsequent videos is look at what practical wisdom is. So the next video is going to be about practical wisdom, and then we're going to look at what wisdom is, right? So we're going to go into more detail about what these intellectual virtues are. The ultimate idea being it's giving us a clearer notion of what exactly happiness is, because happiness is going to be in part deliberation with practical wisdom. It's going to be in part theoretical thinking with wisdom, right? And so we're going to look at these virtues in more detail.